Boop-a-doo, boop-a-doo, boop-a-doo. I've been building a lot of cabinets lately, and cabinets are great and all, but they're just a bunch of boxes. And whenever I build cabinets, my wife always wants shaker style doors, just a frame with a flat panel in there. So we needed this hutch to go under our TV in our bonus room, and I designed this one myself, and the one thing I knew was I did not want to do shaker style doors. I wanted to shaker it up a little bit. Get it? No, I just wanted to come up with a door that was a little bit different and incorporate some new techniques, and the doors I designed, well, they're gonna be really stinking hard. So follow along, see how I make these. It's gonna be quite an adventure because at this point, I don't even know how I'm gonna make them. We'll figure it out together. So here's the overall piece that I will eventually be building. It's going to be a giant 10-foot long hutch that's going to sit underneath the TV in our bonus room. It's going to have drawers on either side with these custom cabinet doors in the middle. Now the doors are what we'll be focusing on in this video because they have some interesting details like the arched top, the glass, a raised panel at the bottom, and the entire thing is going to be made out of this awesome, beautiful rift-sawn white oak. Let me show you how beautiful it is right now. And by let me show you, I mean let me accidentally trip and almost fall on my face like a moron. Now the first thing I did was start sorting through this giant pile of rift-sawn white oak and select some boards that I'll use to make the doors. If you don't know what rift-sawn white oak is compared to regular oak, well here's a regular oak board next to a rift-sawn board. The rift-sawn has this nice straight vertical grain and the regular sawn has all these cathedrals. I much prefer the rift-sawn because, well, it's less busy looking. I started out by measuring the longest pieces I would need for my doors, and then I cut down roughly to length a bunch of pieces that were just a few inches longer than that, so I would have plenty of material to work with. Now, whenever I'm building doors, even though my final thickness is going to be 3/4 of an inch thick, I like to start with either 4/4 or even 5/4 material so that I have plenty of room to mill it down to be perfectly flat because you don't want your doors to be warped. That's not going to be fun to install. So after face joining a board, I edge jointed the board so I had now a perfectly flat face and a perfectly square edge to that face, and then I could take the boards over to the table saw, get a perfectly square edge on the opposite side, and then finally I sent all the pieces through the planer to bring them down to my final thickness. Now because these are custom doors, I actually left them a little thicker than 3/4 of an inch. They're just under an inch in thickness, and I'm okay with that. Once my boards were all milled up, I cut down a bunch of rail and stile pieces. Now my rails and stiles are going to be 2 inches wide. Mostly. I say mostly because I'm doing this giant arch at the top of the door. So the rail at the top of the door has to be a lot thicker than 2 inches so that I have material to cut away to create the arch. So after taking my rough measurements for my doors from my digital drawing, accounting for the tenon that will be on each end of my rail pieces, I went over to the chop saw and I started cutting down all my rails. Now the rails are going to be different thicknesses, with that top one being thicker and then the bottom two being skinnier, but they're all exactly the same length. And this is roughly what the doors are going to look like once I get them hooked together. This really thick rail at the top that will eventually become the arch. I'm going to have a divider piece halfway down to separate where it goes from glass to a raised panel, and then my bottom rail piece. Now this is where things get a little trickier, because normally I would hook these cabinets together by cutting all of my dadoed grooves for my mortise and tenon on the table saw, running a groove down the entirety of all my rail and stile pieces. But I can't do that on these doors, because the upper half is going to be glass, so I don't need those grooves, and the lower half will be a raised panel, and that's really the only place I do need the grooves. But I still have to hold on that upper rail with a tenon, so it needs a groove, but just for that upper rail piece. So in order to make this possible, I'm going to have to do what are called stop dados, which are a lot trickier to do on the table saw because of the curvature of the blade. So I decided to do them on the router table. I measured and marked all of my pieces so I would know exactly where my stop dado, well, needed to stop. I then used a Sharpie to put a little mark on my featherboard, and all I had to do was keep pushing the piece through the router table until my line marked up with my Sharpie mark on my featherboard, and I knew I had reached the end of my dado run. Pretty soon I had these stop dados on the top and bottom of all of my style pieces. Next, I needed to cut tenons on all of my rail pieces that would fit inside of those stop dados or mortises. For this, I just went over to my dado saw and used the crosscut sled to cut a nice 3/4 inch tenon on the end of all of my pieces. But unlike normal tenons on shaker style cabinets, these ones are going to have a shoulder on one side because they're going to have to cover up that rounded profile that the router bit left behind. I'm going to have to do this on the top and the bottom. So the very bottom rail, well, it's going to insert just like you normally would. But this middle rail, that's where we're going to have to cut out a little bit of the tenon to create a shoulder, and we're going to have to do the same thing up top. And I'm actually going to cut out a lot of the tenon because I'm not exactly sure where the arch is going to cut to, and I just wanted to remove enough material to be sure it wasn't going to get in the way. For my little pieces, that shoulder was pretty easy. I just went over to the same setup I had on my dado saw and added a little shoulder to the back side. That looked something like this. With that shoulder created, I can now insert the tenon into my stop dado and cover up the fact that the dado even exists at all, creating a nice place to put my raised panel at the bottom of the cabinet. For the upper rail, it was a little bit trickier to get that shoulder because the shoulder had to be much bigger. So I started out by adding the shoulder over on the dado saw the same way I did on the other rail. But then I measured how far down I wanted my tenon to come to sit in that stop dado and marked out the rest of the material that needed to be removed. I thought about a couple different ways of doing this. Originally I was going to do it all by hand with the pole saw, but that just seemed ridiculous when I have power tools laying around. So very carefully I snuck up on the cut over on my miter saw and went right to that line as far as I could get it cut. And then I just finished the thing off with the handsaw, and I thought this was a much cleaner and quicker way of accomplishing pretty much the same task. In no time, I managed to remove most of that tenon, leaving behind just enough to fit inside my stop dado. And it looked something like this. I should also note, when you're cutting tenons for mortises, you want to make sure that they're a nice, snug friction fit. But you don't want them to be so tight that once you put glue on and they swell up a little bit, you're not going to be able to get everything together. So not too loose, but not too tight. Get it just right, if that makes any sense at all. But as you can see here, I got all my tenons and mortises or stop dados cut. I am now prepared for that raised panel at the bottom, and eventually I'll figure out how to insert the glass at the top. But for now, let's focus on this raised panel that's going to go inside there, not the glass that's going to go inside there. I know this is getting confusing, but we'll figure it out. Now, I had hoped to find a piece of oak large enough that I could just cut the raised panel out of a single piece of white oak. Unfortunately, the widest piece I had was just about a 1/2 inch too small. Darn my luck. So I'm going to have to create some panels by gluing multiple pieces together, which I don't love because that means you're going to have a seam right down the middle of the panel. But lucky for me, because we're building this entire thing out of rift sawn white oak, it's actually pretty easy to hide seams in rift sawn oak because all the grain runs in one direction. So I picked out some boards that looked fairly similar. I planed and milled them down to the proper dimensions, and then I squirted some glue in between them and clamped them together. I mean, how else would I hook two boards together? I'm not going to use bubble gum. Once the glue was all dry, I took them out of clamps, scraped off the excess glue with the Bourbon blade, and I ran the entire panel through the planer to get rid of and hide that glue seam. And as you can see here, that seam pretty much disappears into the rift sawn oak, which is very nice. Next, I had to cut my larger panels down into smaller individual panels that will eventually become the raised panel in the lower part of the door. For this, the easiest way to do it seemed to be the crosscut sled over on the table saw. I just set up a little stop block on the crosscut sled, and I cut out the panels to the exact right size and shape. Now, I've never done raised panels before, so I wasn't exactly sure how to hook them into my cabinet door frame because, well, it's at an angle, it's not a straight piece. But this is what I came up with. The groove on my cabinet doors is 5/16 of an inch, so I measured up 5/16 of an inch on the bottom of my panel. Now, my groove is 3/4 of an inch deep. I didn't want the panel to be the full depth because I wanted it to have room to move, so I measured in 11/16, and where that line crosses the 5/16 line is right where I want the angle of the raised panel to come to so that it should fit nice and tight within my cabinet frame. Now, if that didn't make any sense to you, don't worry, it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me either. I was just hoping I got this thing right, and maybe it'll make more sense when I start to put everything together. Basically, I used the blade as a reference. I moved the piece over until the blade was going to bisect perfectly on that 5/16, 11/16 cross section. And I started cutting the angles for my raised panel. If you're like, what the heck is this jig? You just happen to have that laying around? No, I actually did a full video on this a couple weeks ago because I knew I was going to have to make these panels and this jig was going to come in quite handy. After cutting all the angles on my raised panel, I went over to my cabinet door frames and I slid it in place to test the fit. So far, so good. All I have to do is install this bottom rail piece and hope that it fits. And yes, I don't get things right on my first try very often, but this is one of the few times I was very glad I did, because I really didn't know what I was doing. Then it was just back over to the table saw to cut the remaining 3 panels. This jig is so sweet. I love it. It makes this very easy, and you can do a bunch of other stuff on it as well. If you want to make one yourself, the plans are available on our website, or you can sign up to be notified for when you can just purchase the whole jig, because we're working on that too. With all of my raised panels cut, I gave them just a light sanding to remove any of the burn marks left behind by the table saw, and then I had to pre-finish them. I'm going to be using this Rubio Monocoat pre-aging, and the reason I have to pre-finish these is because these are true floating panels. They're not going to be glued in place because they're solid wood, and I know they're going to want to move seasonally. So you got to pre-finish them before you lock them in the cabinet frame, or else when they move, you're going to get this nice border of unfinished wood around the interior of your frame, and nobody wants that. Now, this pre-aging stuff is pretty wild because it's not technically a finish. It technically is just supposed to age the wood and make it look old and antique. So you put it on, it's pretty dark, and then over a 24-hour period, it starts to dry and lighten up, and it just gives the wood this nice rustic look. But there is a catch. It's not a finish, which means that it doesn't have any protection on it at this point. But I experimented with a few pieces, and the second you put a finish on it, well, it changes the color. It still looks kind of old, but I liked the color just how it was. So I decided to do something a little wild and crazy. Instead of putting a traditional top coat finish over the panels and the entire piece, I'm going to opt for wax paper. Yes, you heard that right, wax paper. Now, I would never do this for a dining room table that's going to get a lot of traffic, but this piece is literally going to sit against a wall in the upstairs of our house under a TV and probably not be touched. So this wax paper is going to transfer the paraffin wax from the paper onto the panels, give it a nice silky smooth finish, and best of all, it doesn't change the color of the piece whatsoever. So after all of my raised panels were pre-aged and finished with wax paper, it was time to glue my cabinet doors together. So very carefully, I just pulled out all my pieces, smeared some glue on my tenons, and shoved them back in place. I tried really hard not to get very much squeeze out on the internal parts of the cabinet door because I definitely don't want to get glue all over those nicely finished raised panels. So don't go squirting glue all over everything like you're adding mustard to a hot dog at a baseball game. Sometimes less is more. Once I had half of the door somewhat assembled, I very carefully slid my raised panel into place and then added my last piece. Now, because I cut all of my pieces to the exact right length that I need them to be finished at, you want to be very careful in assembling because there's no wiggle room to mess up. So as I went along, I took constant measurements to make sure everything was square and parallel to one another. Once I was pretty happy with how everything fit together, I added some light clamps and moved on to the next door. At this point, I still wasn't sure how I was going to cut that arch in the top of the cabinet. So the next morning, after all my cabinet doors were dry, I took them out of clamps and started figuring that process out. I realized the easiest thing to do would be to make one template that I could use on all 4 doors, instead of trying to cut each door individually. So I cut a piece of plywood that was exactly the same width as my overall door. Then I marked down 2 inches from the top of that piece because I want the arch to stop just under what would be the top rail, which should be 2 inches wide. Then I found the dead center of my piece of plywood and I added a little mark so that I could find it later. I mean, if I really wanted to find it later, I probably should have added a big mark, but I'm confident in my finding skills. Now, I decided to use the shaper origin because I could design the exact radius of the circle and everything I needed right on the origin itself. But if you don't have one of these, don't worry, you could cut the same template out with just a circle jig on your router. But I have this fancy router, so I might as well let the robots do the work. If you're not sure what a shaper origin is, it's basically just a handheld CNC where you can design things on it or on your computer, and then it auto-corrects to make sure that you make perfect cuts every time. Once I had the right shape cut, I went over to the table saw and cut my template down, making sure to save that inner circle because I have a feeling we're going to need it later. Then I went over to my first door. I added some double stick tape to the back of the template. I like to use this carpet tape because it's insanely strong and I know the template's not going to move around while I'm cutting. Then very, very carefully, I added the template to my door, making sure that all the edges matched up perfect because I want that arch to dead end perfectly into the sides of my stiles. To cut out my arch shape, I'm going to be using this pattern routing bit from Bits and Bits. It's from their new super HD snazzy coated fancy line. Definitely didn't say that right, but I'll put a link in the video description so you can find out for yourself. I just made a couple shallow passes until I had the arch nicely cut almost all the way through my piece. Then I removed the template very carefully. It's always so nerve-wracking making pieces like this because the farther and farther you get into the piece, the higher and higher the stakes get. Because if you screw up now, you've got a lot of work to do to remake this door. Once I had the template removed, I flipped it over and then just using a regular flush trim bit, I completed the cut using my initial cut as the template. And boom goes the frickin' dynamite. I had a beautiful arch cut out of my door, and it looked pretty darn good. Pretty soon I had the arch cut on not 1, but 4 of my doors, and they were really starting to take shape. Literally.
Now you might have heard that we just launched a new product, the Bourbon Blade. And I gotta say, this would have been a lot more difficult if we didn't have our website through Squarespace. Because we had no idea what to expect when we first launched the product. And these things sold quick. We sold out of the first batch of Bourbon Blades in the first 6 days. But thankfully with Squarespace Analytics, we could monitor how many orders were coming in, we could adjust quantities, and we could send out email notifications when it went from the first batch, which is only going to take a few weeks, to the second batch, which is going to take, well, a little bit longer. Now, we're going to be going down to the Texas Woodworking Festival this year, and we're going to be selling Bourbon Blades in person. Now, that might pose a problem because, well, we have some quantities in person and some quantities on our website, but because we have Squarespace, when we sell directly through the Squarespace app in person, it automatically updates the quantities on our website, so we don't even have to worry about it. Now that the Bourbon Blade's out there, we were a little worried that some people might try to go to bourbonblade.com. But again, you can buy domains directly through Squarespace and you can link multiple domains to your website. So we just bought bourbonblade.com through Squarespace, and it doesn't matter where you go. Bourbonblade.com, find the Bourbon Blade. Bourbonmoth.com, same thing. So if you want to create a professional looking website and you don't have all the web design skills that you think you need, don't worry about it. Just go to squarespace.com/bourbonmothwoodworking and you're going to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain when you use the coupon code BOURBONMOTHWOODWORKIng. You just click that link right down there in the video description. We might have to order more of these. Anyways, back to the build.
Now, I am a perfectionist, and after I cut the arches, I just really didn't like the termination of that arch into the stiles. It was paper thin, it looked a little messy, and I wanted to do something to fix it. My first thought was to bend some wood as a piece of sashing inside the arch. The only problem is, well, oak doesn't want to bend very well. So there was only one solution: steam bending. But again, there was a problem. I did not have a steam box. So after a quick trip to Home Depot, I bought a bunch of supplies and started building a steam box. Now, if you want more information on how I built this and why I built it the way I did, I actually ended up doing an entire video just building the steam box. So you can watch in detail over there. Long story short, I built a box and I filled it with steam, and then I cut a bunch of oak strips to stick inside said box. Now, once I bend these strips, they're going to be a lot harder to work with. So I decided to add an edge profile to one side of the strip before I bent them. And all I really did was a nice round over on each side to give it this cool beaded look. The final dimension of my strips were a 1/4 inch thick, and they were just taller than my doors themselves. The thought is that the bead will stick up just above the profile of the door and give the door some depth and some added character. All I have to do now is bend these pieces of wood. Now, remember when I said I wanted to save this insert on my template for the arch? That's because I'm actually going to use these two pieces to create my bending forms. So I cut a bunch more pieces of plywood and I traced out those shapes onto said pieces of plywood. Basically, I just need a lot more of these pieces because I want to bend all the pieces at the same time, and I don't want to have to wait around to use the same jig over and over again. I think I traced enough shapes to do 8 pieces in total, which means I can make 4 jigs double thick. This is 1/2 inch plywood, so each jig will be 1 inch thick, which should be enough to get an adequate support around the piece as I bend them. After roughly cutting my shape on the bandsaw, I went over to my workbench, and using my original template, I used some double stick tape to stick it to my rough cut pieces and a flush trim router bit to bring it down to its final and exact size. Then I just would hook 2 pieces of the half circle together, 2 pieces of my original template together, and then I screwed everything together so that it didn't fall apart. Because, well, number one, we don't want it to fall apart, and number two, if you don't overbuild a jig, did you ever actually build the jig? I don't think so. Once we had our 2 working pieces, I went over to the drill press and I drilled a bunch of holes in that inner half circle. This is probably more holes than I actually needed, but I didn't want to be in the middle of bending my strips and wish I could put clamps in places that I couldn't put them because I didn't have enough holes. And with my bending forms complete, it was finally time to load up the steam box with my wood strips and just pray that this is going to work. Did I mention I've never steam bent anything in my entire life? So here goes nothing. I left the pieces in there for about 1.5 hours, which according to research should have been plenty long to bend them. Then I rushed over to my workbench, stuck them in my bending form, added this clamp onto the front, and started squeezing. This is also a really good arm workout if you're looking to increase your muscle strength. And would you believe it? They bent into the formed shape perfect. I think I might be doing a lot more steam bending in the future. The next day, when the pieces were good and dry, I had to cut them to the right size. So I cut a little scrap piece of plywood that would continue that arch shape and be the exact size I would need it to be to fit inside my cabinet door. Using that piece as a template, I marked out on either side of my now bent oak arch, and then I carried the arch over to my miter saw to cut that angle at a nice 45 degrees. Because I'm also going to add a straight bottom piece that will connect to each of the outer corners on my arched sashing piece. Did that make any sense at all? It didn't really to me, so hopefully it did to somebody out there. Anyways, after cutting a 45 on the bottom of my arch piece, I went over to my door and very carefully I tried to insert it into its home. This took a little bit of doing, and I might have had to go back and forth to the miter saw a few times that I didn't show on camera. But eventually I got it cut, and then I cut a corresponding piece to go along the bottom, making sure I had a very nice tight fit, which, as you can see me struggling here, it was tight. But I got it in there, and that's all that matters. Now that all of my sashing pieces were cut to the right size and shape, it was time to glue them in place permanently. So I went back over to my work table, very carefully removed the pieces, and added a nice layer of glue onto my cabinet doors. I used my patented glue spreader to make sure that the glue was even all the way around, and then very carefully I inserted the sashing piece, trying not to get glue all over the place. Again, the less cleanup, the better. Once I got the arch in place, I inserted that lower frame piece, and then came the tricky task of figuring out how in the world I was going to clamp all these up. It took a little doing, but I figured it out in the end. I used some of these corner clamp jig things and then just a whole bunch of regular clamps. Tried to wipe off any excess squeeze out that happened to emerge as I glued up. And then the next day, once the glue was dry, I removed all the clamps to now reveal a nice sashed opening. Now, I know this was a lot of effort for literally 2 extra pieces of wood in each door, but I'm really glad I spent the time to do it because I think it looks awesome. And I got to learn how to make a steam box. Now it was time to figure out how to insert the glass into the door. There was just one problem. My opening was round and my glass was not. So I really only had 2 options. Either A, add a huge rabbet to the back of the door to accommodate the shape of the glass, or B, try and cut the glass to match the shape of the opening. There was just one issue. I've never cut glass before. But that hasn't stopped me yet on this project, so I made a template the exact size that I wanted my glass to be. And I decided to label it Glass Template, just in case I lost it amongst all the other templates that I seem to have created thus far in the project. Now, to get the glass to this shape. Oh, I got an idea. I mean, glass isn't that thick, so I figured I could just go over to my router table, use a flush trim bit, and cut it the same way that I got you. I'm not going to cut it on the router table, you goof. I actually have a good friend named Jared who works at a glass company. He said, "No problem, man, I got you." And he showed up with a magic pen. No, literally, it just looked like a pen. He'd score the glass along the line that we traced with the template, and then he would just hook onto it with a little clamp and snap it off. This seemed like some next level stuff. I mean, I could definitely use this to cut a perfect circle in the side of a bank and rob the vault in the middle of the night. I had to have a go for myself. So he handed me the magic little pen, I traced the line, and sure enough, it worked perfect. This is pretty crazy. And this wasn't even flat glass. It had these fancy antique ridges on it. So after a quick lesson in glass cutting, I went to work on the remaining pieces, and in no time, I had them all cut down to a perfect arch. And here's the really crazy part. To get rid of the sharp edges, I just used my Festool sander and regular sandpaper. I mean, what the heck? This is way less complicated than I could have ever imagined. In no time, I had a beautiful arch shape with some imperfections, but it was pretty darn close. Now, how to recess this arch into the back of the cabinet doors. Actually, out of all the things I had to figure out on these cabinet doors, this was by far the easiest part. I just grabbed a rabbiting bit from Bits and Bits, and as you'll notice, I'm going in the wrong direction. Whenever I'm using a rabbiting bit on hardwood, I like to do a climb cut, or pulling the router in the wrong direction first, and just take a little tiny bit off, and then do my full depth in the correct direction. This just prevents any chance of chip out on your pieces. Now, as you can see, the rabbiting bit left rounded corners, and I need them to be squared off in order for the glass to fit in there. So I just added a straight edge on the bottom, and then using a smaller pattern routing bit, I cut off most of the material, and I just removed that last little tiny corner with the Bourbon blade. That's right, it can do it all, folks. Available at BOURBONMOTH.com. I mean, sure, I could have grabbed a regular chisel that was like 2 feet away, but I'm just really excited to use this thing. It's fun, and you know, it's not every day you create your own product. Anyways, pretty soon I had a nice squared off corner at the bottom of that arch, and I tested, and my glass fit in perfect. Man, these doors are starting to look sweet. Pretty excited with how they're turning out. Huh? Yeah. Now, while I was building the doors, I was trying to decide what sort of hardware I wanted for the poles. And then I thought, I mean, I'm building everything else. I might as well just make some custom poles over on my lathe. So I chalked up some chunks of white oak, and I started experimenting around with some different sizes and shapes. And this is where I got sidetracked for probably a day and a half, because number one, I have ADD, and number two, I have a really hard time deciding on what I like. So I made a lot of different knob options, different sizes, different shapes. I mean, this is just a small example of what I did. I actually did like 30 different ones. I was just too embarrassed to show you how much time I spent on all those. Eventually, my wife came through and she decided on the finished shape. Now the key was to try and make 4 identical pieces, which, because I don't do a lot of lathe work and I don't have a lot of practice, that's actually a lot harder than you would think. So I'd make one, hold up another one, and when they looked pretty close, I'd just be like, all right, that's good. Eventually I had 4 somewhat matching poles, and I drilled a nice 1/4-inch hole in the center of each one of them, on the bottom side that is, and then using some 2-part 4-minute epoxy, I had pre-cut some little lengths of threaded rod. I'd coat them with a little epoxy, and then very carefully insert them into the hole until there was a lot of epoxy in there to hold that threaded rod in place. And just like that, I had 4 custom poles for my custom cabinet doors. I drilled the corresponding holes on the cabinet door themselves so that I could make installing the knobs easy later on, and then it was time to pre-finish the entire door. So I filled up another jar of this Rubio Monocoat pre-aging. The color I'm using is Authentic number 2, just in case you're wondering. I coated each door liberally with a nice slathering of this stuff, and then all you got to do is wait for it to dry. So let's wait. The next morning, it looked something like this. You know, I really wish you could see these in person because the camera just doesn't do the color justice. It has such a cool antique vibe to it. I mean, I was stoked with how these turned out. And just like the raised panel, I didn't want to change the color on these at all, so I grabbed that roll of wax paper and I just basically sanded the entire things down with the wax paper. It's pretty impressive how well this actually works to finish the piece. You get a substantially nice coat of wax across the entire thing, and it really becomes silky smooth in your hand. After I had all the doors pre-finished and waxed, it was finally time to install this glass. All I'm using is these Rockler glass clips. I figured 4 clips per sheet of glass would be plenty, so I just kind of randomly threw them on there, pre-drilled, and screwed them in place. Bada bing, bada boom, installed. And then last but not least, for the icing on the cake, I installed my custom-made poles that actually look pretty darn good. And I rinsed and repeated the same steps on the remaining 3 cabinet doors. Pretty soon, I had them all done. And I have to say, if I like the doors this much, I am super excited to build the entire hutch.
Oh, hi. Man, that was a doozy, but it was so much fun. These are my favorite projects when I have an idea in my head, I don't know exactly how I'm gonna do it, and the whole process is just trying to figure it out. I mean, we packed a lot into this one video, from the raised panel to the jig we had to make for the raised panel, to the arched sashing, to the steam box that we had to make in order to do the arched sashing. We used this pre-aging stuff from Rubio Monocoat that we'd never used before. I had to turn the handles. I mean, that was a lot to go into just doors. And the crazy part is, I still have to build the entire hutch that these doors are gonna go inside. But don't worry, we're gonna do a video or 7 on that coming out soon, so stay tuned. Check the links in the video description. I'll link all the products we used in this video. Also, if you forgot, the Bourbon blade, it is out and available for pre-sale on the website. We already sold completely out of the first batch, so if you want one of these, you better hurry up and get in line because they're going quick. Link in the video description. Until next time, stay thirsty. Now, I was trying to tagline and just not that type of guy. See you guys later.